Welcome to the fourth episode of the 10 Lost Tribes in Jewish Consciousness series here on Sefer Chatter, and I'm Nachi Weinstein. In this episode of the series, we move on to the first legendary story of the Lost Tribes legend, the mysterious figure of Eldad HaDani. Just who was Eldad? Was he really from the tribe of Dan? Did he only speak Hebrew? What were these halachas, this Hilchos Shechita, that he came telling the Jews of Kairouan, which is modern-day Tunisia, in the late 9th century? What bearing does Eldad have on the Ethiopian Jews in Israel today? And much more in this episode and in this fascinating story of this really interesting historical figure. So, although some of the earlier episodes touched on Tanakh and Chazal, as we were discussing the beginning and the origins of the legend, going forward, the series really is going to move away from that and will really dive headfirst into various historical stories associated with the 10 Lost Tribes. We're going to have Eldad, and we're going to have David Ruveni, and Menashe ben Israel, and Antonio de Montezinos, and Rabbi Shaul Shklover, and various other stories with the 10 Lost Tribes in Jewish consciousness. We're also going to get to Prester John, something in an analogous story in the Christian legend, but is very important for the 10 Lost Tribes series, and much more. The corporate sponsor of this series, as always, is Gluck Plumbing. For all your service needs, big or small, in New Jersey, with a full service division, from boiler changeouts, main sewer line snakeouts, cammering main lines, to a simple faucet leak, Gluck Plumbing Service Division has you covered. Give them a call, 732-523-1836, extension 1. This episode of the series is sponsored by Mosaica Press. Check out their many titles at mosaicapress.com or at your local Judaica store. And I want to highlight two books, especially appropriate now that we're starting Shemais, by Rabbi Alexander Hool, Pharaoh and Desert Encampments. Pharaoh is about, although the Pharaoh of the Exodus is commonly identified as Ramses the Great, from the 19th dynasty of Egyptian kings, this contradicts with the traditional Jewish dating system, as well as new evidence discovered by archaeologists and researchers. In this riveting study, Rabbi Hool draws on fascinating research from many different disciplines, as well as startling astronomical evidence to establish the convergence of a new Egyptian chronology in line with traditional Torah view. Desert Encampments, another book for Rabbi Hool, is one in which the Torah goes into very great detail about the travels and events that occurred during the Jewish people's 40 years of wandering in the desert. But the time, place, and specifics of many of the events have remained hidden between the profound words of the text. Rabbi Hool provides a meticulous study of the text with a plethora of detail from diverse rabbinic sources, complete with detailed mapping and satellite imagery, in a fresh and exciting attempt to unlock the subtle and cryptic scripture and fathom the events, the journeys, and the significance of the desert encampments. Get your copy of each of these books at mosaicapress.com and use the code CHATTER, CHATTER, for an exclusive 15% off. To sponsor an individual episode in this series or any episode on the podcast, you can email me, sefarmchatter@gmail.com, or see the information in the show's notes below. Additionally, there is now a Sefarim Chatter Substack, who, for those of you who aren't familiar, Substack is like a blog, and you can sign up. It gets emailed to you directly. Most posts are free. There is some bonus content if you want to pay, being a paying member to support Sefarim Chatter, whether monthly or whether that support be yearly. You can check that out. There's a link in the show's notes below. There's also a WhatsApp community chat where new Sefarim and different things are posted, and there's associated chats where listeners can comment about the podcast. There's one about new Sefarim and books. You can check that out in the show's notes as well. And finally, if you can please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast on your favorite podcast listening platform, especially Apple. If you can write a review and you can rate it there, it's very much appreciated. And enjoy the episode. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Sefarim Chatter podcast, and another episode on the series, The 10 Lost Tribes in Jewish Consciousness. And on this episode of the podcast and series, I'm going to be joined by Dr. Micha Perry, who is senior lecturer in the Department of History at the University of Haifa, and we will be discussing Eldad HaDani. And Dr. Perry wrote a book on Eldad as well. I will mention the title of the book, which is Eldad's Travels: A Journey from the Lost Tribes to the Present, published by Routledge Focus. So thank you, Dr. Perry, for joining me.
Thank you, Nachi. It's a pleasure to be here.
So let's start off. Tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your background.
So I come from a German Jewish family. This is relative in a way. I come from a national religious family. I grew up I studied in high school yeshiva and then a Hester yeshiva, where I sort of fell in love with the Middle Ages through studying Rashi and Tosfot and Nachmanides. I always loved history, and I found myself going to study history, medieval history, at the Hebrew University. I studied at the Hebrew University, wrote my PhD there, and then spent a couple of years in postdocs in the United States. Got back to Israel in 2013, and ever since I'm teaching at the University of Haifa.
Now, how specifically did you get interested and involved with Eldad? Who we'll get to who Eldad was in a minute.
So I touched Eldad in my dissertation, my PhD, and there I was working on transmission of knowledge, where the idea was to take these knowledge, whether it's halacha, agada, midrash, whatever, and see how it changed over time. Medieval times is defined as a traditional society. So I wanted to check what that tradition is and how much it's common to Jews in France and Egypt. The overarching question was what binds this people together through the changes. And I took a bunch of test cases, and I saw this story of Eldad, and I saw how it has so many different versions that I had to deal with it. And after I finished this dissertation, it grew into a separate book project.
So let's explain Eldad HaDani. Yeah, so we said Eldad HaDani. So he's from it claims he's from the tribe of Dan. He's from Shevet Dan, and he shows up about 883, 884, right? Let's talk about when does he show up? Where does he show up? What's the basic story?
So we have to start from the tribe of Dan. The 10 lost tribes start, somewhere in the 4th century before the Common Era. After the destruction of the first temple, Shalmaneser sends into exile the 10 tribes, which from now on we'll call them the lost 10 tribes. And all the rest of the Jewish world from there on are from the tribe of Judah, Benjamin, and the Levites, Levi, Mama Levi. So I know where I came from. And then I recall this because this is 1,000 years later. We're now 1,000 years after Eldad, but Eldad comes 1,000 years after the last news from the 10 lost tribes was sound. And he appears somewhere in North Africa, in the city of Kairouan, in Tunisia of our days, and he pops up and he says, "Hello, I came from the tribe of Dan." And everybody is shocked. He comes and he tells marvelous stories. He says, "I'm not the only tribe. We are 4 tribes in this part of the country and 4 other tribes in that part of the country. And we have a king, we have an army, we have soldiers, we're engaging in war all the time. Among us, there's a marvelous nation, the sons of Moses, we'll talk about them probably later, that live a utopian life. And the people in Kairouan are sort of shocked. They didn't hear about the 10 lost tribes for 1,000 years. And they sent a letter to their religious authority of the time, the Gaon in Baghdad, Tzemach Gaon, who answers them. And this is the basis of our knowledge about the story, this letter.
Now, something interesting about Eldad, so you say he shows up in Kairouan. So what language is he speaking? What is he claiming to be speaking?
What language do people in Kairouan speak? They speak Arabic, most of them. So he speaks Hebrew. He speaks pure Hebrew, Ivrit Tzacha, which is a beautiful Hebrew. And he claims not to know any other language. And the people of Kairouan, they pull this shtick on him, which modern anthropologists also do. They say his Hebrew is so pure, there's a lot of words that they don't understand even. He calls a pigeon tintera, he calls peppers darmushim. So they test him, they put him to the test. They point at something and they say, how is this called in Hebrew? He tells them the name, they write it down. And after a couple of weeks, they ask him again, what's the name of this? And he was also always, he said the same word. So they checked on him if he's coherent, and they found out that he is. Now, you probably want to know, is it true that he didn't know only Hebrew? So I'm not a linguistic scholar, but linguistic scholars claim that they found in his Hebrew traces of Greek and Arabic. I wasn't convinced by this argument because I dealt with the manuscripts, and the manuscripts are, the first one of them is at least 200 years after Eldad, and we see the differences between all the manuscripts. One of them has influences of Arabic, and one of them has influences of Greek. So it's hard to say what the original linguistic background that he had, but he had Hebrew. That's the way he communicated with the community of Kairouan.
So, we kind of asked this here. Is there any? Where did he come from? I know he's saying he came from the Sefer Eldad, but do we know where he shows up in Tunisia, so North Africa? Was there any thought or theories of where he was really from?
So we could. There's a lot of theories where he was, but we could just take one step back. The Gaon is in his answer says, I heard about this guy because people from the yeshiva met him in southern Iraq. So we could already start and draw a trajectory of his voyages. The linguistic scholars I mentioned before claim that according to this linguistic trace, he came from a small community, Najran, in Yemen. Other claim in Saudi Arabia. Later on, he was identified with Ethiopia in medieval language, Chabash or Kush in biblical, because he talks about these places. People went as far as claiming that he came from China. Some of the manuscripts has Chin, which is seen China in medieval Arabic. I think the important thing to say here is that the way he describes where he came from is just beyond the known land. He portrays the frontiers of the known land to the community of Kairouan. There's somewhere in the middle of Africa, somewhere toward the east, toward China, and we just beyond that. Just one mile after the end of the known world.
So there's a lot more. I see how we should go here. There's a lot of different things from the story. There's but you know what? Let's go straight to the truth of the guy, and we'll come back to different aspects of the story because I just think that's such an integral part. So first of all, as you're saying, they tested him. The language that he spoke, is this a bird? And they asked him again the next day. So the community is already skeptical, right? Clearly, they're not believing him 100% that this is legit.
I'm not sure that they're not believing him 100% because their query, the question that they sent to the Gaon, is not whether this guy comes from the tribe of Dan or not. Their problem is that this guy brought with him traditions, the laws of Shechita, the laws of slaughtering an animal. And this differs slightly from the tradition that they were taught by the Babylonian Gaonim. And the question, it tells the story of Eldad and what he tells about the tribes and everything, but people tend to forget that the actual question they had is, what do we do with these differences? Is his tradition the right one or ours? And it seems as if their premise is that Eldad is the original, and they question the tradition that the Gaonim have taught them. Eldad he comes from the original. You'll ask in a moment about these halachot, why they thought it's original. But just to clarify your question, so I think they thought that he was authentic. Absolutely.
So they did think so. Okay, so let's talk about the Hilchos Shechita. Yeah, and we'll get back to Rav Tzemach's answer. So they, just for the listeners, they send this letter to Rav Tzemach Gaon in Bavel asking him the questions, and they're going to get a very interesting answer. But let's discuss a little more before we get to the answer what they're really asking about. So he comes with this Hilchos Shechita, and he has, like you're saying, these differences. But even before the Hilchos Shechita, important, I think, to mention that how he says it, he doesn't have Tanoim and Amoraim. He has Yeshua in the name of Moshe, in the name of said from Hashem. That's how he has this unbroken chain, right?
It's marvelous. Yes, we have to come back to the story about the tribes, but part of the attributes of the 10 tribes that he brings is that they're authentic. They weren't corrupted by transmission. They were taken directly from First Temple times to be enclosed somewhere, and they kept the original Judaism in its purity, sort of. And as such, they have this opening of every halacha, and the question says they have a Talmud. They have a Talmud, just like ours. And the Talmud is not in Aramaic, it's in Hebrew. And instead of having this whole list of a Moraim, this and in the name of that, they have it's a direct line. It's Yoshua from the mouth of Moses, from Mount Sinai, directly, which is wonderful. Some versions add also Kalev ben Yefuneh to the list, one generation after Joshua. And now this attribute makes these halakha the original. So the question is on the rabbinic one. And we want to talk about these halachot. The halachot is a fascinating question. He brings only Hilchot Trefa. Okay? It's a lot of zoology about animals and different diseases, etc., etc. The scholars that dealt with the halacha, and correctly so, I think this is the really the most important thing with the story. The story is related to the 10 lost tribes, and everybody loved that part of the story. But the halacha is really something that you could sink your teeth into and try to say something important about it. So these halacha scholars said that it's Sumerian, that it's Karaite, that it's Hilchot Eretz Yisrael, that it's all. You could say everything about them. And they checked the differences between this and the halacha of the Gaonim. Now, I took a different approach here. First of all, I said they're obviously something different. They're not Babylonian. They're not also Eretz Yisrael. At this time, we had at least two big schools. You had the Hilchot Israel and the Babylonian school. They were different, the rites between these two places. We could mention a couple of differences in Hilchot Trefa. The land of Israel checked 18 internal organs, and the Babylonians, like we do today, checked only the lungs. So what I said is that, first of all, these halacha are obviously different. They're not this and they're not that. That's what makes them so important. They're not Sumerian, they're not Karaites, they're not Babylonian, and they're not according to the land of Israel, though they're closer to the land of Israel. You clearly see within them sort of an attempt to bridge the gap between Shechita and Korban, and the sacrifice in the temple. They have a set of laws that are more similar to how you sacrifice an animal in the temple. And I said we shouldn't look at the differences. We should look at the commonalities between the two. The main idea here, and here I'm going into the idea of this text, I think, in a way, the main idea is that the tribes also have a Talmud, like we do. And in order to understand this, we have to remember that we are at the eve when one of the largest medieval sectarian movements in the Jewish history appeared, and that's the Karaites. And the Karaites had one simple claim. They said the rabbinic lore, Mishnah, Gemara, Talmud, that's an invention by the rabbis. We adhere only to the Bible. And all of a sudden comes Eldad, and he's the original, straight from Mount Sinai. He has a Talmud. So the differences are much less important in reading this text than the similarities. That's the main idea of this text, that the tribes have a Talmud. And I think that it has a very strong aspect of anti-Karaite propaganda, this text, the original, and Sefton original.
And that's a very key point, and that's very important in Rav Tzemach's answer, where he talks about Eldad. But I do want to mention, just once we're discussing the halachas, and you discuss this whole chapter in the book titled "Men and Women." Very interesting. We're going off the Mishnah and Chulin, where you do discuss something that kind of differs, but people don't realize maybe that Eldad ends up in contemporary halacha today, so to speak, when we have, everyone, as you read in the English translation, everyone may slaughter, and the slaughtering is kosher except for a deaf person, imbecile, and a minor, lest they batch a job. Taisus discuss woman, and then the Mordechai,
right?
Yeah, then the Mordechai brings, right, that is the Mishnah. And then the Mordechai brings, he quotes Eldad, and they talk about, because Eldad says that women can't do Shechita. And then you end up with the whole discussion, Rami Rothenberg, and ends up with the Rush and the Torah, and ends up that women can't do Shechita, but originally, really, there isn't a problem.
First of all, I'm not a modern halachist. For medieval Ashkenaz, yes, Eldad influenced them, and they adopted this law that women can't perform the Shechita. I think Yemenite communities and Italian communities and other modern communities allow women to slaughter. But in Ashkenaz, yes, he goes all the way there. The Mordechai brings him. There's another manuscript that cites him. They cite him by name. They say Rabbi Eldad said this and that. They know the story, and they use that in order to claim that women can't perform Shechita. And you see the evolution. It's not this text. Eldad is not a standalone text. It's not a Mishnah, right? When they need to use it because they don't want women to perform the Shechita, they use it. But a generation before that, even though they knew the text, they said that's chumrah. Chumrah, that's just if you wish, you could do this, but actually women can do Shechita. So it's a text that it's used for different ideologies all the time, for changing ideologies.
And interestingly, just to point out one more point about this, is you quote the Rami Rothenberg and his tshuva on this, and again, you have the English, so I'll read the English because I have it in front of me, and you said, on the matter of slaughter by women, can they engage in such activities? And he answers, it is already evident from Tractate Zvachim and Masechta Zvachim that slaughter is permitted for women, even to begin with. And that which is cited from the laws of the land of Israel, which is what they call the Hilchos Eldad, is brought by those who want to innovate and who rejoice in a thing of naught. So right. Robert Berg is saying that this is mutter. I don't know where this is coming from, this new chumrah, from this work of Hilchot Eretz Yisrael, which, interesting, I don't know, just clarify, so why exactly were they calling it that? They were assuming that that's where these halachas were from, this Hilchot Shechita.
So this is apparently later generations cite Eldad by name. The Tosfot in Maharam call it Hilchot Eretz Yisrael. There's two answers here. One might be that they identified it with the Yerushalmi, sort of it's the same language. And other Hilchot Eretz that we have from the Geniza. We know of parallel texts like Eldad text. So they read Eldad and they identified him with Hilchot Eretz. One scholar claimed something very interesting. He said probably it said Hilchot Aleph, right? Hilchot Eldad, or Hilchot Amar Yoshua Aleph Yud, and somebody opened it as Hilchot Eretz Yisrael. Originally, it was Hilchot Amar Yoshua. That's how they knew the text. That they gave the text according to the first letters of the text. Amar Yoshua bin Nun. Joshua said. So at this stage, Tosfot and Maharam cited as Hilchot Israel. Later on, Mordechai says, flung out that this is Eldad.
So there's more to discuss in halacha, but let's move on. So as you say, they send this letter to Rav Tzemach Gaon about the language, then they go into about this is where we have a lot of this stuff, and they talk about these halachas as you mentioned, and you mentioned already the Karaite. So what does the Gaon respond to them?
So the Gaon doesn't mention the Karaites at all. But what he does says, he says two things. One, Eldad is right. His story is correct. And all what he tells you is collaborated but by our sources. Now, the reason for this is because Eldad actually used, sort of earlier material. So the Gaon finds the same material in Eldad's story. So first of all, Eldad is correct. Nevertheless, he he reinstates a Babylonian supremacy over all other traditions. He says there's one Mishnah we all drink from, and then there's different Talmuds. The Talmud of the land of Israel, Talmud Yerushalmi, which is in one certain in Aramaic, our Talmud in another type of Aramaic, and now there's the Talmud of the Shvatim, the 10 lost tribes Talmud. They also have their Talmud, which is in Hebrew. But remember that the sages of Babylonia, they were from Jerusalem. They were taken by Nebuchadnezzar directly from the temple to Babylonia, and they possess the only true tradition. And Eldad must have, because of and he says so, because of the journey, the long journey, he must have forgotten stuff or mixed things up. So you have to adhere to our tradition. So he can't deny Eldad and the story about the 10 tribes, but he does reinstates Babylonian supremacy over all other traditions. And he says something, he does two small things that are worth mentioning. First of all, he calls Eldad Rabbi Eldad, Reb Eldad, so that he's one of us. And this is a way of putting something strange, bizarre, alienated into a world that that you connect to. Rabbi Eldad is one of us. And then he also mentions, and what Eldad told you, that the tribes, first of all, they pray every Shabbos for the sake of the sages of Babylonia. That's very good that they do this. This is what you should do as well. We don't have no mention of this. It doesn't appear in any of the texts that we have of Eldad. Either you made it up, or we lost that tradition. But we all do this. When you meet something that you don't know how to cope with, you translate it immediately into terms that you know.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. And as you mentioned, he says they were davening, they were praying for the Chachmei Bavel, the sages of Babel, of Babylonia. So this text of this letter of Rav Tzemach Gaon. So this is. Do we have different editions in the manuscript, or is only one?
Okay, now you're getting into philology, my favorite part of the whole discussion. So what we have about Eldad is a bunch of texts that were all printed together in 1480 in Italy, and as a book called Sefer Eldad. So this is very late. We're talking about 500 years after Eldad himself. When you go back to medieval manuscripts, we don't have the manuscript from which this was printed out. We don't have the original one. We have bits and pieces. We have sort of citations here and there. The answer of the Gaon, this response of this shoot, a fragment of it, quite a big chunk, but still a fragment, appears in an 11th century manuscript, which shows that the letter existed then, that it was more or less the same version, but not entirely exactly the same.
And as you mentioned, interestingly, this Sefer was printed in 1480, so it's in Ikanabula. It was printed really, really early, together with really other important works, Rashi, Alatar, or whatever. This Sefer Eldad is being published.
One of the first, Abraham Konat, yes, the printer in Mantova in Italy. Yes, it was. You talk to Moti ben Melech, about what happened in the 16th century Italy about the 10 lost tribes. That's when it booms. Yes,
I'll tell listeners, stay tuned. That'll be the next one of the following episodes on this series. So listeners,
it's a segue, promo.
Yeah, promo, exactly. From Eldad, we'll get to the 15th and 16th centuries with Moti ben Melech. So some other things about it. So you mentioned another thing, philology, as you mentioned. You mentioned that Eldad kind of was drawing on other ancient sources. So similar sources, that's why Rav Tzemach Gaon was familiar. How did you find that? How were you looking at the various texts? You were able to see this?
So let's divide here the discussion between the halachic part and the Agadic part. The Agada part, it was a bit more difficult, but we have sort of stories about 10 lost tribes that are in the same vein, sort of the Sambation, we'll probably get into that also, appears in earlier texts. He's not the first one to talk about it. And then you have a text, an 11th century text, in a book in southern France by Rabbi Moshe Darshan, which is word, verbatim, word to word, what Eldad says, but it's later. But and this is what I did, when you sink your teeth into this text, you see that it represents earlier traditions, and that Eldad elaborated on them. In philology, we have this law that if a short text and a long text, sometimes it could show, in this case, it's easier to show that one text elaborated the other. It's not a shortenance of the text. This is the Haggadah and stories about the 10 lost tribes. You have also in Arabic and other languages, you have parallels that you could see that he used, and some very famous midrash that he also incorporated into it. In the halacha, there's no direct parallel text, but there's a group of similar texts that popped up in the Gniza, and they disappeared over the years because these laws went through a process of unification to abide to one Babylonian rite. But there's a bunch of texts that are parallel to this. The Hilchot Eretz Israel and in the Shechita there's something. So you could see there's a lot of parallel text to this with similar notions of Shechita.
So you did mention the Sambatin and mentioned earlier Bnei Moshe. We kind of got away from that. We really should get back to that.
Yeah, that's
the fun part, and it's also just important, like you said, even the philology aspect of things. So let's talk about the Sambatin first. The Sambatin listeners may be familiar, but you can talk about what does Eldad have to say about the Sambatin specifically?
So Eldad describes he has two parts to his 10 lost tribes description. The first part is the daily life of the tribes. And these are 4 tribes that they have sort of a kingdom somewhere. They're constantly in war with the nations around them, but they have an army that patrols the land and fights against their enemies. And they have a king that distributes the loot among the sages, the Torah, and etc. It's sort of it's supposed to be a utopian society. It's not. But on the other hand, they have among them, there's the sons of Moses behind the Sambaton. And here he tells a story. He says, we have this tradition that generations ago, in the middle of the night, we heard a noise, a huge rumble, and a cloud came down from the sky and put down the Levites from the temple. They were in exile, they told us later. They were in exile, and they refused to sing the songs that they sang at the temple, to sing it for the king of Babylonia. And a cloud came, picked them up, and put them in our midst, in the midst of the 10 lost tribes. And God put a river just around them. He circulated with a river. This river has no water in it, only stones, and it rushed so strongly that the stones will crush anybody who attempts to go into the river. This river is called the Sambaton, and it's called the Sambaton on the basis of Shabbat, because it flows rocks and sand very aggressively for 6 days a week, and it poses on the Sabbath. And within this river lives the tribe of Levi, and they have a truly utopian society. They have no diseases and no foul animal, only kosher animals. Nobody lies there. If anybody says a lie, he dies immediately. They have a just life. This is a utopian society. Now, okay, we'll go back to
No, we continue with the Bnei Moshe. I mean, what's so first of all, it's so interesting. Like Sambatyon, there's different, and again, stay tuned, listeners, for an episode specifically on Sambatyon. But he does the rock tradition. There's different like exact traditions of the Sambatyon. But then also, as you're saying, it's not the Aseret HaShvatim. It's not the lost tribes that are beyond the Sambatyon River.
Right.
Next to them, it's the Bnei Moshe that are beyond. the Sambatyon River.
This is something that is unique to Eldad, and this was a big part of my thesis, where I said Eldad actually freed the 10 lost tribes from behind the Sambatyon. He brought them. That's why it's so intensely messianic. He brought them, to the doorstep of every Jew in medieval time. He kept only the sons of Moses behind the Sambatyon. We all know that the 10 lost tribes, and this appears in the Talmud, are behind the Sambatyon, somewhere over there, and they can't come. The idea of the Sambatyon is that during 6 days of the week, physically, you can't cross it. And on the seventh day, because they're so justly, because they're so saintly, they don't cross the river. So only when the time will come, God will free them. But Eldad did this before him.
Right, like you're saying, Eldad frees him, and then. So I mean, we can speak about the later traditions. So later on, this kind of gets. Do they kind of get put? They kind of get put back.
Not only the other later tradition, other stories about the 10 lost tribes, stories about Menachem that goes to visit them and other people, but also the traditions of Eldad, meaning the same text that were copied over and over during time. They also, the copyists or the readers or the writers, they changed the story so the whole 10 tribes would be enclosed behind the river Sambatyon. It was just too much to bear, the thought that they're just waiting here around the corner, and they're not showing up. So scribes copy this text, change it slightly so it would enclose not only the sons of Moses, the Levites, but also the whole 10 tribes.
Now, the next thing, another connection here in this story, another key part is something that again arises centuries later, is Prester John. There'll be a specific episode in the series on Prester John, again, not a Jewish legend, but I think you can just give a basic, brief description of Prester John and kind of the parallels and the connection of Prester John to the Eldad story.
Right. So in the 12th century, mid-12th century, appears in Europe this letter from a king who's a priest, a Kohen. He's a priest king, which makes him a just figure, called Prester John, and he lives just beyond the known country, just beyond the Muslims who now conquered back the land of Israel, and he has an utopian land. This is a classical text of an enclosed nation living in an utopian land. And this is what I was looking for when I read Eldad. In this land, Prester John, he enjoys all the riches. He has crazy animals. I can't even name them. There's so crazy names. But and all of Greek mythology, all of the what Le Goff called the imaginaire, the imaginary of humanity was pushed and squeezed into that small land of Prester John. The Amazons, the Pygmalions, the people with faces in their chest, people with just one leg, crazy stories. The background of this story is probably the Crusader state being at war with the Muslims and losing that war. And sort of a compensation, Christianity needed a victory, a king that could gain over the Muslims, and imagined this king, Prester John. This is extremely widespread throughout Europe, and very well known, a zillion of text in every known language in Europe. Now, the interesting thing is that among all these crazy things that are in the land of Prester John, there's also the 10 lost tribes. They're there somewhere. And also a river of sand, and an ocean of sand, the whole geography of imaginary places. So I have an article about the relations between them. I try to show philologically that the text of Prester John knew of Eldad HaDani, and it's sort of a response to Eldad HaDani. And then I went into different versions of Prester John and different versions of Eldad HaDani over time, seeing how they reflect each other. So, for example, Prester John says, you should know that the Jews, the 10 lost tribes, they have a king. And he says it like this: yes, as they told you, the Jews have a king, but they didn't tell you that this king pays tribute, meaning he pays taxes to us, to me, Prester John. So here we go into theology. Apparently, there's a dialogue here. The Jews said, we have a king and a free nation. This was important for the Jews because according to Christianity, Jews are punished by God because they crucified or allowed to be crucified Jesus, and that's why God expelled them from their country, and they lost their independence. This is God's wrath, and this in the Middle Ages time, the fact that Jews did not have a country was proof that Christianity is right. So, to counter this argument, Jews said, no, but we do have a king. Here, the 10 lost tribes. There's a magical king somewhere. He's very powerful. He's extremely strong. And we do have a king. The scepter did not leave the tribe of Judah. And in the story of Prester John, you hear the answer. Yes, the Jews, they're right. They have a king. They have the 10 lost tribes. But that king is subjected to us. He pays us tax. So there's a theological argument happening here. I think I titled my article, The Imaginary War Between Prester John and the 10 Lost Tribes, because that's what happened. European Jews and Christians were having their theological debates fought for them by two imaginary figures, the 10 Lost Tribes and Prester John.
And some of this, as you said, there's an article, but some of this is incorporated into your book.
Yes, absolutely.
On Eldad as well. So what happens to Eldad? Do we know what happens to Eldad himself? Going back to Eldad himself, not a story. Do we know what happens to him at the end? Like I said, he shows up in the 9th century, in 884, around. Do we know what happens to him after that?
So according to some traditions, he continued to Spain. And he dealt in Spain. There's hints to this. It also makes sense. In Spain at the time, Al-Andalus, in Cordova, in that region, they were very powerful and rich Jews. He might have continued there, but no, we don't know what happened to him. If he existed, ask if he existed at all.
Let's get to that. Well, there's kind of two things. First of all, did he exist? I mean, why would one assume he doesn't exist, being that we have all this textual evidence? Before we get to whether we should believe his stories or whether he was a charlatan, but did he, as you said, did he exist, and why should we assume he didn't?
So, I think we could assume that he didn't because most of these texts are extremely late, and they're very elaborated literary constructions. For example, let's put aside for a moment the answer by the Gaon, but there's sort of a letter that Eldad wrote to the community in Spain, allegedly wrote, and in this letter he tells the whole story of how he and a friend of his from the tribe of Shimon escaped the 10 lost tribes, and then they were kidnapped by cannibals, and the cannibals ate his fat friend, and he refused to eat non-kosher, so he was saved. This is a story that draws on Muslim parallels, specifically the Sinbad stories, and it's very late, and it evidently is literary construction that somebody attributed to Eldad. Now, in this case, it's obvious, but I could say this on every single text of Eldad. the Hilchot Shechita, we have traditions from other, we have parallel texts. Somebody took a whole text and attributed it to Eldad. Even the letter to the Gaon, the Gaon wrote at 884, supposedly. Tzemach Gaon, we know very little about this Gaon. We don't have his response or whatever. This is basically the only text he has. But the first evidence of this responsa is from the 11th century. It's almost 200 years later. So I could make try to claim that Eldad is an imaginary figure, that a bunch of texts were attributed to him. Now, to counter this argument, I should say that in the 10th century, sort of a generation or two generations afterwards, there's some very credible authors that mention Eldad. It's not the text. One of them is Chestai ben Shafrut. He's the wazir. He's a prime minister of the Caliph of Cordova, and he says, in the time of our ancestors, we had a visitor from the tribe of Dan, and this guy used to say, quote, halacha in the name of Joshua said from the mouth of Moses from the land of God. So he doesn't mention the name Eldad, but he's a very authoritative figure, and he mentions Eldad's text. Another one is a halachic figure from Kaiwan itself that mentions Eldad, the name Eldad. So as an historian, I think that it's safe to conclude that there was a figure named Eldad that appeared there in the 9th century and claimed to come from the 10 lost tribes. The attribute Hadani is attached to him from the start, from the beginning, and he brought with him some halacha, and probably there was a version of the letter sent to the Gaon back and forth. But the vast majority of text, and we're talking about a bunch of texts that are attributed to him, are not 100% his. Some of them are later forges, and even if they are his, they underwent a very long process of changes during the generations. It's very hard to go back to the original.
So this plus the related question of, was Eldad, again, assuming he existed as you came out, was he a charlatan? I mean, and I mentioned this, I think, on the previous episode with Tzvi Benit. I'll mention it here. In Ibn Ezra on Shemai, you discussed Ibn Ezra on Shemai. The pasuk says, "V'telu bein Dirka Shemai Gershom," and they call him Gershom. Ki Amar Gerisi Beretz Nachriya. So Ki Amar, and the Ibn Ezra says Moshe. Moshe is the one who said this. Zayt Tzipayra Isha Kushas Asher Amar. And he says it's going on at Tzipayra. Asher Kasav B'Divrei Yamim De Moshe Al Tamin. Don't believe it. V'klal Amar L'cham. I'll tell you a rule. Call Sefer Shalai Kasvu Neviim Chachamim Pia Kabbalah. Anything that wasn't, any work that wasn't written from Neviim or Chachamim, from tradition, from Kabbalah, a tradition, Ein Lismechalav. Don't rely on it. Va'af Ki Yesh B'Dvarim Shemachishim Adas HaNachayim. Even has things that contradict things. What you would think, the Kacha Sefer is Zerubbabel, it was Zerubbabel, Gam Sefer Eldad HaDani, and so to the work of Eldad HaDani, V'Daimulem. So Ben Ezra is like, don't believe this book, don't rely on this book, don't rely on it, he says, not really, but he's essentially saying he doesn't believe this. And there are others. So what are kind of, was he a charlatan, and what are the opinions of, but I want to just say before I leave you the question, like we already mentioned, the Mordechai and others are quoting him, bringing him down in halachic work, so they're giving credence to him, they are believing it.
Right. So first of all, it's really two different subcultures. Mordechai in Ashkenaz and Ibn Ezra in Spain are very different. And Ibn Ezra is an halachic figure. But so he's not the only one not to believe him. Ibn Ezra, also Abraham, the son of Maimonides, also doesn't believe him. Because it's crazy stories. First of all, it's crazy stories. Second of all, it contradicts the tradition of the Geonim from Babylonia. These are two very good reasons not to believe him. And again, even the Ashkenazim, when they use him because that's what they want to do. They want to forbid women from doing Shechita, so they use Eldad because they found Eldad. In other matters, they don't use Eldad. Eldad says that not only a woman shouldn't do Shechita, also an old man above 80, a younger guy younger than 18, you can't do Shechita if you don't cover your head, if you don't do Shechita, if you don't go to mikveh, etc. But among modern scholars also, most of the scholars claim that he was a charlatan. And first of all, modern academic thought has no proof of the existence of the 10 lost tribes. Definitely not that they preserved their tradition for 1,000 years. On top of this, when you read Eldad, and as I point out, he's obviously a post-Talmudic figure, meaning he knows the Talmud, he knows the Mishnah, he knows the Haggadah. So he definitely did not come from the lost 10 tribes. You could try and claim that he came from one of the 10 tribes that wasn't lost, that kept being in touch with the main tradition of Judaism somewhere in Yemen or in Africa. We'll probably get to that also soon. In medieval times, I don't think the word charlatan even is appropriate when you talk about medieval times. People believed what they were told. But did Eldad come from the 10 lost tribes? Definitely not. He could have come from a community that, according to its own tradition, thought it was part of the 10 lost tribes. That's an option that I'm willing to accept. Because he definitely his tradition are unique. Everybody agree about this. So and these traditions, I think at least the laws of Trefa show sort of a practice. They were evolved a long time. They have close information about zoology, and you see they were practiced. So I don't think it's far-fetched to say that he came from a community at the edge of the Jewish world, India, deep into Asia, Africa, that was in touch here and there with the main tradition of Babylonia, the land of Israel, etc., and developed its own tradition. Maybe this community also had a tradition that it was part of the 10 lost tribes.
Eldad still has serious ramifications today. Major halachic ramifications, and he still, you're in Israel, and Eldad really matters there. Why? Because we pick up the story with Radvaz in Egypt in the late 15th and 16th centuries. There's a Shiloh written to the Radvaz, from David ben Zimra, and there's a question written to him that was a Cushite woman. You can say the story and you can say the answer. There's a Cushite woman. Do you want to say the question? You can say the question.
So yeah. The question is it's a Jew in Cairo who had a slave that was captured somewhere deep in Africa. Now, at the time, every household had to have slaves. We have. I explained to students this in a way. You have a refrigerator, running water, and a washing machine. In medieval times, those were slaves. In order to have household, these were slaves. We could understand this historically, and yet not, agree with it or accept it or justify it. It's an historical fact. And at this time, most of the slaves were captured in Africa, deep into Africa. I just mentioned that in the early Middle Ages, for example, most of the slaves came from Russia or Ireland, and they were blonde and blue-eyed. In this case, he has a black female slave who claims that, the question arrives to the Radvaz because he wants to marry her. And she claims that she came from a Jewish tribe, and that she saw her husband being killed in a raid. Now, the question is, whether we could count on her testimony that her husband was killed and see her as a widower, that he could marry her. And Radbaz here goes into the whole story of whether she's Jewish or not. It's a different story, and what kind of Judaism she practiced. Now, Eldad, from here, and we go on to Rabbi Yosef, Eldad does not appear in these texts. But what happened, and I think that Eldad is in the background of this story, is that Ethiopian Jews, probably the Beta Israel in this case, became to be identified with the stories of Eldad. And like the same way that the Gaon, 600 years before that, sort of transformed them into something he knows and attributed a Talmud to them. They're Talmudists. We could discuss Rabbi Eldad. Again, Eldad is the basis on which the Ethiopian Jews are accepted into Judaism. And Radbaz says, and he almost quotes verbatim the text of Eldad, though he doesn't mention Eldad, describing their life and their wars. And he says, yes, they're a tribe. They're not Karaites. He's also obsessed with Karaites because they're a big problem at the time. And if this tribe denies Karaism and accepts Rabbinic Judaism, they're Jewish. No problem.
Now, there's actually two, right? So there's two responses. There's two questions, two tshuvas here to Radbaz. And then this gets picked up in 1973 with Rabbi Yosef,
right,
about the Ethiopian Jews of today. Are they Jewish or not? Now, Rabbi Yosef is going to go back to the Radbaz, who, again, as he said, is coming from Eldad. So we can talk about that.
I'm a medievalist, but still, I ventured into the Psak of Rabbi Yosef. This is a fascinating story. Apparently, Yemenite Jews crossed over the Red Sea and settled in Ethiopia and married Beta Israel, Ethiopian Jewish women there. They brought them back to Israel. One of these guys, who was an army officer, approached Rabbi Yosef with a question about his wife's tradition, being from Beta Israel. This is this is how Rabbi Yosef got entangled in this. And this tshuva, people forget this, but this tshuva is, unanimous. He claims these are 100% Jews. No need of conversion, no need of even not hatafat dam brit, what they do today, or tefillah, nothing. And his main source is Radbaz. Absolutely. He says he already met them, he decided that, and we accept them. But the difference is that he also doesn't mention Eldad. He's based on Radbaz, and both of them were rabbis in Cairo. Rabbi Yosef was also, as a young man, he was a rabbi in Egypt, and I think that influenced a bit his attitude here. The difference is that he's worried about mamzers. If they didn't marry or divorce for centuries, according to rabbinic Judaism, it's a problem. So he rules that they're Jewish, and they did not marry according to Din Moshe v'Yisrael, Kedat Moshe v'Yisrael. So their marriages were not halachically valid, and so they didn't need to be divorced. So there are no mamzers over there. It's a genius, as he always is. So it's a genius way to approach it. And the connection I found here is that I think that one of the reasons that he doesn't mention Eldad is because Eldad says that they had a Talmud, and Ovadia Yosef doesn't want them to have a Talmud, so their marriages won't be valid halachically. Now, if you turn the page to see Ethiopian Jews themselves, they actually, the tradition that they came from the tribe of Dan is something new. They adopted this from rabbinic Judaism. According to historical traditions, they were descendants of King Solomon. through the king of Sheba and Manelik and the whole thing. And that was their tradition. Only from the 16th century onwards, they adopt from rabbinic sources the idea that they come from the tribe of Dan. Now, this connection, the only place that you could connect the tribe of Dan, why the tribe of Dan? Why not the tribe of Zvulun or Yisachar or I don't know who? The only connection to the tribe of Dan is Eldad HaDanite. That's my smoking gun here.
Yeah, it's really interesting. You do mention the whole thing. Rabbi Feinstein argued him, Rabbi Waldenberg, Tzitz Eliezer argued him. So this was a major, more recent halachic fight.
Right.
And there are others that also agreed with the Radvaz. You mentioned Yaakov de Castro, was the Marikash,
the student, right?
The student of the Radvaz, who was the chief rabbi in Egypt after him, and others in there. So this is a very interesting. And then there's a chapter in this on the book for those that want to read more about this, a whole more modern story that is in there. So, I was going to ask you about Eldad's story throughout the centuries, what kind of happens to it, but I think we kind of covered that even up till today. But I will just ask you about the Sefer Eldad. You mentioned it, the actual work being printed in 1480 by Konat as an incunabula. So, for those that are interested in still seeing that edition, and you mentioned different manuscripts, has there ever been any sort of critical edition done? What kind of edition if anyone's interested in reading the actual work today?
So the book is scanned at the National Library in Israel. You could find the whole book scanned online. You go through the catalog, Sefer Eldad at the National Library of Israel. There's only, I think, actual two copies in extent today in the world. And they became really famous during the 16th century because that was a time when all of a sudden the world, was opening and people found the Americas and thought again that maybe this is the context to which we have to understand Native Americans, etc. But as a medievalist, I really want to go back to the original, story of Eldad. What Eldad, we talked about that Eldad actually freed the 10 lost tribes from behind the river of Sambatyon. And this we have to understand in the context of when that happened. This is the Jewish people, this is the beginning of the Middle Ages. We're like 200 years after the whole region was conquered by Islam. Europe is starting to develop extremely intensively. And the Jewish people was already in exile for 800 years. And sort of Eldad really is the one that, first of all, he brought back the 10 lost tribes into circulation. All your theory about the 10 lost tribes, you could talk about the Sambatyon and the Talmud and the Mishnah, whatever, in Roman history, but this whole fuss about the 10 lost tribes, it's thanks to Eldad. He's the guy that put them back into circulation. And he's the guy that freed them behind the 10 lost, the river Sambatyon, and transformed them from a magical, imaginary figures into actual present that are on our doorstep. And if you compare the story to Prester John, you see how strange the story of Eldad is. The 10 lost tribes, they have nothing magical. They have this ordained kind of life. They're very strong warriors, and they fight over and over. And when I read this story, when you read the land of Prester John, the merit of his land is that everybody live in peace. But the land of our 10 lost tribe, they're always engaged in war. If they're so powerful warriors, why don't they win already the war? That's what I asked myself. And then you figure this is the moment when Jewish diaspora was born. And the one thing that they were missing, sort of, is this normal kind of life, this life of an army, political life, a king, an army, power. So you see a society that imagines what it misses, what it lacks. And this is, I think, as a historian, this is the insight that Eldad gives us. It's not magical. It's really realpolitik. It's very actual. In a way, and this, I didn't put it this way, one of the scholars did, Eldad is the first Zionist in a way. Sort of gave the Jews an idea you could have a normal political life with an army, a king, and a state.
So further reading on Eldad, I will mention that I'll link to your book in the show's notes. And your book is nice. It's about a little more than 100 pages. It's not a big book, and it's very affordable on Amazon. It's like $20-something, so it's like $22, I think.
I'll tell you something. It's very hard to write a short. I worked very hard to shorten it. I really wanted a book that somebody could read on a flight, and then I discovered it was too short. Some of the publishers told me it's too short.
Yeah, I think I read it almost the entire thing on one Friday night. So I think it's
right.
It's that type of, it's great. You can just read it. But I'll link to that in the show's notes. What about any other reading on Eldad?
So on Eldad, there's very few work done on Eldad himself. But I'll mention, maybe if you're interested, there's Rebecca Voss's new book on the Sons of Savers, the Red Jews in Yiddish culture. The Red Jews is the name that the 10 lost tribes were given in the Germanic tradition. And her book is sort of a continuation of my story after the Middle Ages. Moti Ben Melech's book about Reuveni and the search for the 10 lost tribes in the 16th century is very important. Beyond the Jewish sphere, it's always nice to read one of the greatest historian, Natalie Zimun Davis's book, Trickster Travelers. It's about Leo Africanus, also sort of a trickster that travels around the Mediterranean in the 16th century and tells a story. I must mention David Malkiel's article in there's a journal called Jewish History, and David Malkiel published a fantastic article, which I disagree entirely to his claim, but still I have to top my hat to him, where he brings up this claim that Eldad's description of the 10 lost tribes and the existence of people coming from the 10 lost tribes to Europe during the Middle Ages are actually true. That there were tribes somewhere beyond I don't know where, and all kind of visitors came from the tribes to Europe or to Jewish communities around the Jewish world. I don't agree. I entirely don't agree, but I think it's very thought-provoking and very interesting, nevertheless. And
I'll add in also, stay tuned for the episode, but the new Alan Verskin's translation of David Reuveni's diary as well. Another fantastical tale of someone purporting to come from the lost tribes, for those interested in reading. And I'll link all this stuff in the show's notes. So thank you, Professor Perry.
Thank you, Nachi. It was a pleasure.